Hello and welcome to Let's Talk, a podcast series produced by Hazel and Betty Ford. Today our topic is stress and alcohol. In these times especially, it seems like every day is a stressful day. A pandemic, economic turmoil, political discourse, changing jobs, extreme weather phenomena, a world that seems to be upside down and changing faster than we can keep up with. A stressed out world too. But what happens when stress gets mixed with alcohol? After all, many people find an elixir to the stress of daily life with a glass of fine red wine, a cold beer, or a shot of warm whiskey. Hello everybody, I'm your host, William C. Moyers, and my guest today is Damir Utrzan, my colleague at the Hazel and Betty Ford Foundation. Dr. Utrzan is the manager of mental health services for our organization. He's also an adjunct assistant professor at Hazel and Betty Ford's Graduate School of Addiction Studies. His academic and professional credentials are impeccable, but let me call out that he has earned his doctorate in family social science, couple and family therapy specialization from the University of Minnesota. And I could go on, but as it relates to our topic today, Damir knows firsthand about the intense stress of upheaval from what happened to him as a child in what was then known as Yugoslavia. Welcome, Dr. Utrzan.
Thank you for having me, William.
Thanks for being with us. Tell us about your childhood experience back then.
Yeah, as you briefly alluded to, I was born in the former Yugoslavia, which has since become Bosnia and Herzegovina. And it's been over 30 years ago now when interethnic conflict and genocide at that time displaced the largest population in human history. And my parents are interethnic. My dad's Serbian Orthodox, my mom Bosnian Muslim. And so they were in a relationship that before the conflict was acceptable and encouraged, but then during and after the conflict became a catalyst for violence and discord against groups that previously got along just fine. So my mother and I, we left to live in Germany with her oldest brother while my dad remained behind because he was drafted into the Serbian military. And we tried to get along and rebuild our lives to the extent we could while my father looked for ways to get out. But after several months, my mother and I decided to return because they couldn't be apart. And so we moved around the war-torn country trying to find peace and stability, which was and remained elusive. And so we returned to Germany. And it wasn't until really I was in graduate school that I found out my father was trafficked across the border by the mafia at that time because he didn't have documentation. Him and I would sit and talk about all the different things we've gone through as a family, and that's when I realized that my personal experience with alcohol had a really profound impact on my understanding of the illness, the disease, if you will, and how it impacts functioning across the lifespan.
So how does alcohol work to reduce stress or affect stress?
Right, so in order to understand that, I think we need to first define and operationalize stress. Broadly speaking, stress is defined as a phenomenon when an individual's ability to cope psychologically and physiologically to a contextual factor exceeds a certain threshold. So with that understanding, when we turn to alcohol specifically, but really any other substance, it activates the gamma-aminobutyric acid neurotransmitter in the brain, which has a depressant effect. And that depressant effect induces a calm state of relaxation with 1 to 2 glasses, depending on the type of liquor, within half an hour. And those are the short-term gains.
So there's nothing wrong with people having stress, and we all have stress in our daily lives. Is there anything wrong with having a drink after a stressful day, or after you put the kids to bed, or when you come home from work?
As with so many things in our field, it depends. There's nothing inherently wrong with having a glass of fine red wine, as you mentioned in the introduction, with dinner or during social events and gatherings. But on the other side of the spectrum, which is what makes it so easily accessible, is the maladaptive coping. So when we get into a pattern of drinking and consuming alcohol after the end of the day to feel relaxation, warmth in our body, over time we become used to that. And that can exponentially increase over time. And before we know it, we are drinking 2 to 3 glasses of wine at the end of the day to get that same feeling. And it doesn't become an issue or a problem until we no longer are able to function without it.
So if people have stress in their lives, and we all do, if people use a substance like alcohol, which many people do, although I can't because I'm in recovery, just because they use a substance like alcohol doesn't mean they're going to become dependent on it.
No, you're right. And you bring up something important, the term dependence, and I keep going back to definitions because so much of societal stigma is around our understanding and definition of terms.
Yes.
In 2013, the American Psychiatric Association reclassified substance use disorder from being a dependence-related issue to just collapsing it into substance use disorder. That move was done for two reasons. One, to really delineate definitions so there's not crossover across substances, and two, to reduce stigma, because substance use disorder implies something very different than substance use dependence.
Which term do you prefer? I mean, layman like me, as a recovering person, I know the term alcoholic or alcoholism, substance use disorder, addiction to alcohol and other drugs. They're all effectively the same, yes?
Right, they are. And part of it is just our evolution of understanding. And I would say that for a family, friend, or a loved one, it doesn't matter what you call it. But in the clinical world, we tend to refer to it as substance use disorder because it depersonalizes the problem externally rather than something being wrong with the person.
We know that stress affects the human body. You refer to that. How does it affect it physically and emotionally and mentally?
Right. So the effects cut across multiple domains of functioning. Physiologically, depending on, again, the type of liquor consumed and the alcohol content, within a matter of really 30 to 45 minutes, you'll start to have a warm feeling in your body. You'll start to sweat, so your galvanic skin response will enter. You will start over time to really lose memory, focus, and your inhibition will be significantly reduced. Psychologically and emotionally, alcohol is actually a depressant. So what it does, it reduces, which speaks to kind of that stress you were alluding to, the hormones responsible for the body's stress response. And so that's also one of the reasons why we typically hesitate diagnosing depression for 2 to 3 weeks following withdrawal, because the symptoms mimic each other so much.
I think it's interesting. I mean, I know that alcohol is a depressant because I've heard experts like you talk about it, and yet people get the effect of feeling good. That's that warm-bodied feeling, that sense of relaxation, and yet it's a depressant.
Right, because you have to think about depressant in the sense of reducing or curbing the effects of anxiety and stress, not necessarily inducing clinical depression as you would think.
Yeah. How does stress affect cravings for alcohol?
Right. So going back to that pattern that I was briefly talking about, over time, it's really subconscious that we start to drink 1 to 2 glasses a day, which then moves to 3 to 4, and that's that behavioral component. And then you start to associate it through positive reward, whether that be socializing or different events where it's socially acceptable and maybe even encouraged. So that drives the wedge between what is maladaptive, if you will, or an ineffective coping strategy with just being around people you love.
Yeah. Does trauma create stress?
Well, you bring up another good point that generally we refer to trauma as a type of stress, and it is referred to as traumatic stress. So there are multiple types that have changed, again, over the past decade, but traumatic stress is something that happens to a person, whether that be human-made, such as war and conflict, as we discussed, or natural disaster, as a displacement induced by climate change. And that also pushes the body beyond its ability to cope effectively.
What's your counsel when somebody starts to use alcohol to take the edge off, so to speak, and then discovers that they have a hard time stopping their use of alcohol?
It's so important to be honest, above all, with yourself. It is really challenging to start to understand, conceptualize, maybe even accept that there may be a problem. And it may be even harder to have a conversation with a family or friends and reach out. So it's much easier to kind of get back into that cycle of withdrawal. But sitting and trying to understand what you're going through is, I would say, the first step to recovery.
What about the use of appropriate medications to address people who are struggling with stress, for example, or anxiety?
Yeah, so we know from countless years of research that the body is such a unique and complex mechanism, and that if the stress or anxiety, the depression is strong enough, it can effectively override any psychotropic intervention. And we refer to that as psychosocial symptoms. So oftentimes you will see people who have, for example, withdrawal symptoms from drinking alcohol. They may have a stutter or they may have the shakes, but that in turn induces anxiety of when am I going to get the next drink? And that's a complex dance between neurochemicals and various other hormones in the body.
What's the role that meditation plays in helping people cope with stress?
Yeah, so medication for some people is an effective way to learn those coping strategies by themselves. Because really we don't want to use it as replacement, because then you're taking one thing for another. And again, if you have a clinical subset of symptoms that really prevent you from functioning in your daily life, in your work, in your family, then that is certainly the first intervention. But we really want to move towards understanding integration and coping with not just psychotropic intervention.
What is your counsel then? What are some tips for managing stress without alcohol or other dangerous or addictive substances?
Again, going back to being honest with yourself, reaching out to friends, family, loved ones, and recognizing that as much as you feel alone,
Yes.
that there are other people who feel the same way.
That sense of community, togetherness.
Exactly. Think about the history of Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous. It started with community, with fellowship. And people think of it as something related to an abstract concept, but it really means that, I'm not alone, there's other people. And at the end of the day, you and I can talk about similar experiences like the conflict in the former Yugoslavia, but our experiences are going to be different.
In fact, I often talk about the fact that addiction is an illness of isolation, and the antidote to it is that first word of the first step of the 12 steps, we, or community. And your point is that community is an effective support system for people who are going through a tough time.
Yeah, that's right. And I think about clients who share their stories, friends and family, when they describe the first time they set foot on our campus in Center City.
Yes.
From the moment they cross our threshold and they are greeted with a warm smile and an encouraging word for perhaps the first time in their life.
Yeah. We only have about 2 minutes left. We could go on and on. I find it fascinating, your level of expertise and your ability to explain it in terms that even I understand. But what happens if it all seems like it's just too much? Somebody says they're just stressed out. What happens next? What's your counsel if they feel stressed out?
Given everything that's going on in the world today, I would be more concerned about people who say they're not stressed out. Right? So if you feel like it's too much, you're too stressed out, you're overwhelmed, reach out to someone, to anyone. Start connecting. Try to make a plan and rely on others to help you pull through, if you will. It doesn't have to be a journey you take on your own.
And what about family members? How can they spot a loved one who is stressed out or in dire straits as a result of stress and anxiety?
Oftentimes we have gut feelings that we may or we may not listen to because we all know our loved ones better than sometimes they know themselves. And broaching the conversation from a place of compassion and caring rather than directive does much more to promote change, both short-term and long-term, than some of that frustration that can come out in lieu of.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us a resource or two before we close where people can go to find more information about what we've been talking about?
Absolutely. So of course people can go to the Hazel and Betty Ford Foundation's website where we list various different resources. Outside of that, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, a branch of the Department of Health and Human Services, really does a lot of the research and the data-driven approaches to gather resources and make them available to people nationwide.
Last question with less than a minute to go. I can't help, we've sat on this set here over the last 2, 3, 4 years and done lots of podcasts. I've always found it unbelievable that I have gone from being a patient at Hazel in 1989 to get to see and listen to and talk with people who are experts across the continuum of our mission and beyond. And I'm just struck, this is the first time that we've been together. I'm awed by the next generation of leaders in our organization and the sheer amount of expertise that you have and your ability to articulate it. I really appreciate it. I've got to ask you on a personal note, what fires your passion? Why do you do the work that you do?
Speaking to what we discussed previously, what are the odds of you and I sitting down and talking about a single event in time from different perspectives, you reporting on it in another continent and me going through it myself, and yet we sit here today and share a common theme and life experience. And that's what drives me, the hope and the first time that people experience that, life can be better regardless of what happened.
Yes, and thank you so much for your expertise and really instilling in our viewers and our listeners that sense of hope and help and healing. So, Dr. Utrzan, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, William.
And thank you all for joining us. As we always remind our listeners and viewers on this podcast, remember that addiction to alcohol and other drugs, it does not discriminate. But treatment does work and recovery is possible. So if you're feeling stressed out or anxious or wrangling with whether or not you're an alcoholic, remember that the most important thing you can do is reach out and ask for help, and do it now. I'm your host, William C. Moyers. I hope you'll join us for another edition of Let's Talk. See you soon.